Hey there and welcome back to another Avatar video. And today we're going to dive into the Legend of Korra to speak about one of the spicier topics in the fandom, shipping. And more specifically the main ship, or the final ship, of the Legend of Korra, Korrasami. And yeah, before we go any further, I will be saying one thing: this isn't going to be some homophobic rage bait, so take that elsewhere if you want that. Just so we're clear, I do quite like the story if I'm being honest with you, but that being said, I do kind of side-eye when people hold it up as the greatest example of representation ever, because, yeah, it was good for its time. But surely this is not the pinnacle, right? Right? But yeah, today, we're going to have a lot of questions to answer. Does Korrasami make sense? Did it come out of nowhere / feel out of character? And overall, was it handled well? And we'll answer those questions as we go along, starting with does it make sense? Honestly, yes. Because at no point in the story does it feel out of character for these characters to be attracted to one another, right? They don't walk around with a giant sign over their head that reads, exclusively heterosexual. Plus, on top of that, your late teens / early 20s are famous times for discovering who you are and all of that sort of stuff. Plus, they go through some pretty massive emotional journeys and rely on one another quite a lot. Plus, they have the bonding experience of both having dated the less than ideal Mako. Seriously, looking back, at the time, when I was a teenager, I kind of thought they did Mako dirty sometimes, but in hindsight, the dude sucks. But yeah, I just don't see how it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, does that mean it didn't feel forced or came out of nowhere? Now, I think you can make arguments for both sides of the equation, right? For some people, I think it did feel forced because, like I mentioned earlier, it was a big change in direction for the character. You start off with Mako as the obvious main love interest for Korra, and that continues through book 1, through book 2, and there's lingering tension within book 3. But that's all really. Then you have a big time skip, and by the time our heroines meet back up, they're at the blushing stage. They're vibing each other pretty hard after years of intense letter writing. Must have been some steamy letters, I'll tell you what. Whilst there may have been some, chemistry I guess you'd call it, in the end it felt like something that wasn't really planned at the time by the writing team. I don't know if they've said otherwise, but it's just my point of view. It felt like something that in the first couple of seasons a lot of the fans were feeling like would be a really good idea. They were enjoying the chemistry. And the writers agreed, and so they decided to add it in when they were writing the final season. That's really how it feels. It might not be what they say, but it's definitely how it looks. And from that point of view, I get it, sort of. But like from the get-go, when they see each other, it's pretty clear what's going on as well, when they meet back up. And so in that way, it's a season-long romance arc, much like Mako and Korra in season 1. You knew where that was going from the get-go, so I don't see how this feels any different. I think what threw people off is that there was a major romance in Korra's life beforehand. Usually, in almost all forms of media, we're conditioned to the protagonist meeting their main love interest and just sticking with them. And whilst there are perhaps some minor speed bumps and alternate ships along the way, in that case Mako and Asami, in the end the main couple gets together and you're golden. There you go. But this took a more realistic direction, in that relationships are complicated and life doesn't always play out the way you'd expect. And so, if we're asking whether it feels forced, I would say that if you look at the finished work and then look again on a rewatch, no, it's not forced. It was a simple, one-season, vaguely romantic arc. And that's fine. For the time, it was fine. But yeah, we'll talk about that in another minute. So I guess, at this point, we've answered the question in the title. Was Korrasami forced? Did it feel realistic? But I do think there's still more to unpack here. Because honestly, I'm not really 100% satisfied with how things have played out. And I think part of me is just a little bit confused. Because this thing, like I said, is often held up as one of the all-time greats for representation. But I guess surely by now it's been surpassed. Surely. But even then, was it ever that forward-thinking? Yeah, they have a relationship. But to me, it very much feels like an afterthought throughout that entire season. Like they write the story and then they tack it on. Whilst I have mentioned that I don't mind that Korrasami only had one season to build up, I can't help but think, the two major relationships we had for The Last Airbender, Aang and Katara, and Sokka and Suki, they both got much more dedicated screen time than Korrasami did across 3 seasons. And honestly, considering they plan on continuing stuff in the films and stuff, they'll have more screen time than Korrasami ever will in my eyes. Korrasami instead gets a Zuko Mai level of dedication, and even that's probably a bit generous. We get the initial attraction, the discovery of feelings, like we do with every other relationship, but then, well, forgive my crudeness here, but you get instantly blue-balled, and they just end it looking at each other, staring into each other's eyes, maybe holding hands, can't quite recall. Yeah, I get it. The TV producers weren't going to go for a same-sex kiss back in 2014. But it still shows such a marked difference that 10 years beforehand, you could have multiple kisses between heterosexual people. And hell, there's even a scene that heavily implies that Sokka and Suki had sex and they're minors. You can have that in the mid-2000s, but then almost a decade later, a kiss between two adults is what sets off the morality censors. And instead, what do we have to make do with? Comics, graphic novels, whatever you want to call them. I truly, truly despise when key plot points are put into a form of media that only a fraction of the fan base is actually going to engage with. It's a show. Put this shit in the show. Fuck the censors. I mean, the first kiss, the reaction of all their friends and their joint ex-boyfriend. Stuff that would have been great to see animated. Imagine his face. Wasted in a very average comic. It's just like when they did the whole Zuko's mama arc. It was heavily built up in the show, and then they just tossed it into a comic. A subpar comic, too. Don't get me started on that shit. I'll need a shot in the neck with a tranquilizer dart in a minute. And once again, I'm not necessarily shitting on the creators here, because it was a different time, I suppose, but I really can't resist giving off one of those exhales of frustration. Whenever you see talk about what a pioneering plot point this was, because I can't help but feel like it was very half-baked. And there are so many other shows, not even a decade later, only a handful of years later, that delved far more into this sort of stuff. And they tackled the same sort of subject matter with far less restriction, while simultaneously receiving so much less acclaim and less attention for doing so. I remember this blew up the internet at the time. And so whilst it does deserve to be noted as an early example, like when in the 40s they had one black actress and nominated her for an Oscar and had to get an exemption to let her go because of segregation, it's not like those are groundbreaking events. The true groundbreaking cartoons are ones that actually showed that kind of stuff. And so ultimately, when you break it down, I feel like the whole Korrasami relationship in the confines of the show, not in fan works and not in the comics, the show really does feel like a mega afterthought, even less than Bolin and Opal. And honestly, I think it's quite a shame. And so yeah, I think this video really did get away from me a little bit. I really started out just to try to debunk what was once a popular point of view. Or at least it was when I was 18 and they first aired that scene. That Korra had gone woke and that same-sex relationships felt forced doesn't make sense. And I'd been stewing on that for almost 10 years, so I wanted to say something. And instead, it ended up transitioning into me venting my own frustrations about that storyline and the way it was handled from a writing and production point of view, and the supposed legacy that it's garnered. An undeserved one in my eyes. I think it's overrated. And so yeah, with all that being said, nothing much else to say on the topic. I know my opinions might have been a little spicy today. And so I would like to remind you that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of what I've had to say? Do you think I'm on the money here, or maybe you disagree? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.